Jimmy Savile was never an ordained pastor in the traditional sense, and yet for decades he operated inside the Christian religious ecosystem with a level of access and protection that many clergy could only dream of. In the United Kingdom, Savile became one of the most disturbing examples of how proximity to religion, churches, hospitals, and faith leaders can be exploited to shield monstrous behavior. His story belongs here because it exposes a hard truth. Corruption in modern faith does not require a palpitantly unchecked reverence. By the time Savile died in 2011, he was regarded by the British public as a national treasure, a philanthropist, a tireless fundraiser, a man knighted by the crown, a devout Catholic known for his loud declarations of faith, his close relationships with clergy, and his frequent appearances at churches, hospitals, and youth institutions. Priests praised him publicly, bishops defended him, religious charities welcomed him, and behind that wall of faith and authority, Savile committed acts so widespread and so horrifying that investigators would later struggle to comprehend how it went unnoticed for so long. Savile spoke openly about God. He wore religious symbolism. He regularly attended Mass. He cultivated friendships with senior figures in the Catholic Church, posing as a champion for children, the sick, and the vulnerable. He raised millions for hospitals. He gained near-total freedom of movement in institutions that housed children, disabled individuals, and the elderly. His access was unquestioned because he appeared devout, charitable, and untouchable. What no one wanted to acknowledge, what many actively ignored, was that Jimmy Savile was a serial sexual predator on an unprecedented scale. The abuse began as early as the 1950s and continued for more than half a century. Savile preyed on children, teenagers, and vulnerable adults, often inside hospitals, schools, care homes, and religiously affiliated facilities. Survivors later described assaults that occurred in plain sight, in rooms that were supposed to be safe. Often, after Savile had used his religious reputation to dismiss suspicion, he exploited confession culture. He exploited obedience to authority. He exploited the deeply ingrained belief that a man celebrated by priests, bishops, and charities must be beyond reproach. Many victims tried to speak. Some told nurses, some told teachers, some told clergy, and again, the response was silence or worse. Protection of Savile himself. Priests minimized complaints. Hospital administrators dismissed reports as misunderstandings. Charity leaders insisted Savile was incapable of wrongdoing. Some survivors later testified that they were told they would be damaging the church if they persisted. Others were warned that no one would believe them over a famous, knighted man who raised millions for God's work. Savile understood exactly how to use faith as armor. He cultivated religious authority figures carefully. He donated visibly. He attended services publicly. He ensured that when accusations arose, his defenders were already in place. Being seen alongside priests and bishops wasn't an accident, it was strategy. A man wrapped in religion benefits from a unique kind of protection. The reluctance to believe evil can exist so comfortably alongside holiness. After Savile's death, the truth exploded. Investigations conducted by British authorities revealed hundreds of victims, with estimates ranging into the thousands. Abuse occurred in over 20 hospitals, including children's wards and psychiatric units, many of them under religious or charitable oversight. Savile abused victims as young as 8 years old and as old as elderly patients who could not resist or report. One of the most damning revelations was how repeated opportunities to stop him were ignored. Staff had reported him, patients had complained, journalists had raised concerns. Each time Savile's reputation, built in part on religious association, shielded him. Internal reviews later concluded that senior figures within institutions connected to the church failed catastrophically. Some leaders admitted they had heard rumors but chose not to pursue them. Others claimed they believed Savile's charitable image outweighed vague accusations. The damage was irreversible. Survivors spoke of decades of trauma, addiction, broken relationships, and estrangement from faith. Many said the most painful aspect wasn't just the abuse, it was being ignored by institutions that claimed moral authority. For them, religion became inseparable from betrayal. Savile's case forced the United Kingdom to confront a brutal reality. Corruption in faith is not limited to ordained clergy. It thrives anywhere reverence replaces scrutiny and charity replaces accountability. In the years following the scandal, the Catholic Church issued statements expressing regret for its association with Savile. Some dioceses removed photos and honors, Investigations criticized systemic failures, but for survivors, apologies came far too late. The damage had already spread across generations. What makes Savile's story essential in any examination of corrupt pastors and faith leaders is this: he proved that the power of religion does not lie solely in sermons, it lies in trust, and trust, once corrupted, becomes the perfect hiding place for predators. Savile never preached from a pulpit, he never led a congregation, but he benefited from the same protection corrupt pastors abuse every day: unquestioned moral authority. And when the truth finally surfaced, it revealed something even more disturbing than a single monster it revealed: institutions willing to protect reputation over children. The lesson of Jimmy Savile is devastatingly clear. When faith is treated as immunity, evil flourishes. When charity replaces accountability, redditors thrive. And when religious authority is shielded from scrutiny, corruption doesn't just survive, multiplies. This was not just a failure of one man, it was a failure of everyone who chose faith over truth, and the victims paid the price. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. At the edge of rural Sweden, in a quiet village called Knutby, faith once promised order, belonging, and divine purpose. It was the kind of place where church bells and scripture felt comforting, where trust came easily, and where few imagined that belief itself could be turned into a tool of control, manipulation, and systematic abuse. But behind the calm exterior of the Knutby Philadelphia congregation, a dark experiment in power was unfolding, one that would culminate in murder, shattered families, and one of the most disturbing faith-based criminal cases in modern European history. At the center of it all stood Helge Fossmo, a charismatic preacher who presented himself as humble, chosen, and spiritually enlightened. To his followers, Fossmo was not just a pastor, he was a conduit to God, someone whose words were meant to be obeyed without question. Over time, he transformed religious devotion into unquestioned submission, bending scripture into justification for cruelty, deception, and ultimately, death. Knutby Philadelphia was a Pentecostal church built on intensity. Members lived closely intertwined lives. Homes were shared. Marriages were influenced by church leadership. Personal decisions from work to relationships were filtered through spiritual authority. Fossmo and the church's inner circle preached purity, loyalty, and obedience, while quietly rewriting the rules behind closed doors. One of the most disturbing aspects of Fossmo's rise was how he entwined theology with emotional exploitation. He convinced members that God communicated directly through him. That resistance to his guidance wasn't just rebellion, it was sin. Dissent became spiritual failure. Questioning leadership became a betrayal of God himself. Among those drawn into Fossmo's orbit were women who believed they were participating in a divine plan. Private conversations turned into secret instructions. Scripture became justification for suffering. Several women were manipulated into intense psychological dependency, where their sense of worth depended entirely on approval from Fossmo and other leaders. By the early 2000s, the situation inside Knutby had become deeply unstable. Marriages were strained, jealousy was weaponized, emotional abuse was constant, but hidden under the language of holiness. Members who expressed doubt were isolated. The outside world was framed as dangerous, corrupt, and hostile to God's true purpose. Then, in January 2004, the illusion shattered. One night, a woman named Alexandra Fossmo, Helge Fossmo's wife, was murdered in her home, shot while sleeping. Her death shocked the village. Just hours later, another man connected to the church was shot multiple times but survived. At first, these appeared to be senseless acts of violence in an otherwise peaceful community, but investigators quickly began uncovering something much darker. Text messages became the unraveling thread. Messages that instructed, messages that pressured, messages that framed murder as obedience to divine will. Police discovered that the woman who carried out the attack, a devoted church member, had been guided, manipulated, and controlled through a barrage of religiously framed messages. The trail led directly back to Fossmo. He denied direct involvement at first, portraying himself as a grieving husband and spiritual leader, overwhelmed by tragedy. But evidence told a different story. Investigators uncovered a pattern of emotional manipulation, spiritual coercion, and psychological dominance. Fossmo had used scripture and claimed divine authority to influence others into committing acts they believed were commanded by God. The woman who pulled the trigger believed she was fulfilling a holy mission. That belief didn't come from nowhere. It was cultivated. During the investigation, former members came forward describing years of control and fear. They spoke of sermons that shifted unpredictably, of leaders humiliating members under the guise of correction, of private spiritual counseling sessions that dissolved boundaries and fostered obedience through shame. The trial that followed transfixed Sweden. Prosecutors laid out how Fossmo had orchestrated events without ever handling a weapon. His influence was indirect but absolute. By framing his desires as divine instruction, he turned faith into a weapon more effective than force. Helge Fossmo was ultimately convicted of incitement to murder and sentenced to life in prison. But the damage extended far beyond the courtroom. Families were torn apart. Survivors struggled with guilt, grappling with the realization that their faith had been manipulated against them. Some lost their belief entirely. Others were left questioning how easily Scripture meant to inspire. Compassion had been twisted into justification for cruelty. The Knutby case forced Sweden to confront an uncomfortable truth. Corruption in faith does not always look greedy or violent at first glance. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wrapped in sermons, hidden in community, enabled by trust so complete it overrides instinct. The church in Knutby didn't collapse overnight. It fractured slowly, crack by crackers. People realized that the God they were taught to obey had been replaced by a man demanding loyalty at any cost. What made this case especially chilling was how ordinary everything looked from the outside. No extravagant wealth, no global empire, just a small village, a pastor with influence, and a belief system exploited until it turned lethal. The victims of Knutby weren't ignorant, they weren't foolish, they were faithful, and that faith was used against them. This is the reality behind corrupt pastors in the modern age. Power doesn't need size. It only needs unchecked authority and people taught never to question it. In Knutby, belief was the currency. Obedience was expected. And when faith became law, the result was irreversible tragedy. Because when a pastor replaces conscience with command, and when God's voice is claimed by one man alone, the line between devotion and destruction disappears. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. In the borderlands of Ireland, where church steeples once dominated both skyline and conscience, Father Sean Fortune was treated as untouchable. He was a Catholic priest assigned to parishes in County Wexford and later County Monaghan, man entrusted with confession, counseling, and the spiritual care of children. For years, parents welcomed him into their homes. Schools opened their doors to him. Bishops transferred him quietly when concerns surfaced. And while the system protected him in silence, children were left trapped inside a nightmare that faith itself helped conceal. Entered the priesthood in a country where Catholicism was not merely a belief system, but a governing force. In late 20th century Ireland, priests were moral authorities, often deferred to above teachers, doctors, and sometimes even law enforcement. Questioning a priest was seen as questioning God's order. That reverence would become Fortune's greatest weapon. From the outside, he appeared unremarkable, soft-spoken, bookish, and deeply involved in youth education. He volunteered in schools. He organized parish events. He positioned himself close to children who were struggling, framing his attention as spiritual guidance. Families trusted him precisely because the church told them to. The abuse began quietly. Boys described being singled out for special attention, private prayers, extra tutoring, trips framed as religious mentoring. Fortune exploited the confessional dynamic, using secrecy and guilt as tools of control. Scripture was twisted into obligation. Silence was framed as obedience. Resistance was labeled sinful. Some victims were assaulted repeatedly over months and years. Others were manipulated psychologically before any physical abuse occurred. Fortune fostered dependency, blurring spiritual care with personal control. Children later recalled being convinced that what was happening was God's will or a test of faith. As early as the 1980s, complaints reached church authorities. Parents whispered concerns. Teachers noticed behavioral changes. Rumors circulated. Yet, instead of confronting Fortune, church officials responded with what would become a devastating pattern across Ireland: reassignment. He was moved from parish to parish, keeping him within the church while placing new children in harm's path. At no point was law enforcement meaningfully engaged. Internal church correspondence later revealed that senior clergy were fully aware of allegations. Their priority, however, was not child protection, it was reputation management, scandal avoidance, damage control. Survivors who spoke up were often dismissed or discouraged. Some families were urged to remain silent for the good of the church. Others were left to navigate trauma alone. Branded troublemakers in deeply religious communities where loyalty to the church defined social belonging. The violence escalated. Victims later described rape, degradation, and psychological torment. Fortune's manipulation grew more brazen as he realized the system would not stop him. Each transfer reinforced his sense of immunity. Each ignored complaint emboldened him further. By the late 1990s, some cases finally reached authorities, but even then, progress was slow. Shame, fear, and church influence delayed justice. Survivors struggled for years to be heard in a society only beginning to confront the scale of clerical abuse. In 1997, Fortune was finally charged with multiple counts of sexual abuse and rape involving children. The case shocked Ireland not because abuse existed, but because of how long it had been allowed to continue. He never stood trial. In 1999, before proceedings could conclude, Sean Fortune took his own life in a holiday chalet on the coast. For survivors, his death was not closure, it was another theft, another denial of accountability, another way the truth slipped through their hands. But his suicide triggered something else. Exposure. Investigations uncovered how repeatedly Fortune had been protected, how complaints were buried, how the church prioritized image over lives. Bishops were forced to answer questions they had avoided for decades. Documents revealed deliberate decisions to keep him active in ministry, despite knowing the risk. The Irish public reacted with fury. The Fortune case became a turning point in Ireland's reckoning with clerical abuse. It added weight to an already growing movement of survivors demanding transparency, justice, and reform. Government-led inquiries followed, exposing not isolated failures but systemic corruption patterns of concealment that extended across dioceses and decades. For survivors, the damage was lifelong. Many struggled with addiction, depression, and fractured relationships. Faith, once a source of comfort, became inseparable from betrayal. Some left the church entirely. Others carried faith forward, stripped of illusion, scarred by the institution meant to protect them. What makes Sean Fortune's crimes especially devastating is not only what he did, but how effectively the system around him enabled it. No global no flamboyant cult persona, just a priest, a collar, and unquestioned trust. His story shatters the myth that corruption in faith requires spectacle. In reality, it often thrives in quiet places, small parishes, rural communities, institutions where obedience is praised and doubt is discouraged. Ireland learned, painfully, that faith without accountability becomes a hiding place for predators and that corruption is not always loud. Sometimes it whispers from the pulpit, protected by tradition and defended by silence. Sean Fortune was not an anomaly. He was a product of a system that valued appearance over truth. And when that system finally cracked, generations of victims were left to ask the same haunting question. How many children could have been saved if faith had answered to justice instead of protecting its own? That question still echoes through Ireland today. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. In the world of modern Christianity, few figures exposed the financial corruption of faith as nakedly as Peter Popoff. His crimes were not hidden in back rooms or whispered confessions. They unfolded in front of television cameras, packed arenas, and millions of desperate viewers who believed God himself was speaking through a man on stage. Rose to prominence in the United States during the late 1970s and 1980s, a golden era for televangelism. Cable television transformed faith into spectacle, and Popoff understood the power of performance better than most. He claimed divine healing abilities, he claimed prophetic knowledge, and most lucratively, he claimed that financial miracles awaited anyone who obeyed his instructions and sent money. Popoff's sermons followed a predictable but devastating formula. He appeared energetic, authoritative, and divinely confident. He would call audience members by name, illness, and personal circumstance, presenting his knowledge as proof he was chosen by God. To viewers at home, it looked like undeniable evidence of supernatural insight, but behind the stage lights, it was a lie. Investigators later revealed that Popoff's wife had been feeding him information through a concealed earpiece. Detailed personal data collected from prayer request cards, filled out by attendees, was transmitted live as Popoff pretended the knowledge came directly from God. Faith wasn't guiding the performance. Surveillance was. The victims were overwhelmingly vulnerable. Terminally ill patients, disabled individuals, single parents drowning in debt, people clinging to hope when medicine, family, and society had failed them. Popoff promised healing. He promised prosperity. He promised that God would erase illness and debt if followers demonstrated faith through donations. Seed faith, he called it. The more you gave, the greater the miracle. People emptied savings accounts. They pawned valuables. They sent grocery money. They went into debt believing God would reimburse them with abundance. None of it came. When investigative journalists exposed the fraud live on television in the mid-1980s, Popoff's empire appeared to collapse. Recordings of his wife transmitting information directly into his ear shattered the illusion. His healing claims were dismantled. His donor manipulation was laid bare. In 1987, Popoff declared bankruptcy. Millions of dollars were unaccounted for. Families were ruined. Lives were destabilized not just financially, but spiritually. For many victims, the betrayal ran deeper than money. Popoff hadn't merely taken funds. He had taken trust. He had spoken in God's name while lying without hesitation. Survivors described feeling humiliated, ashamed, and spiritually hollowed out. Some never returned to any church again. One might expect this to be the end. It wasn't. This is where Popoff's story becomes one of the most disturbing examples of modern faith corruption. Not because he was exposed, but because exposure didn't stop him. In the 1990s and 2000s, Popoff quietly rebuilt. He rebranded. He adjusted his language. He shifted focus from televised healing to miracle debt cancellation and divine financial transfers. Letters began flooding mailboxes across the United States and Europe, often targeting elderly individuals. These letters promised miraculous debt relief, lawsuit wins, and unexpected checks from God. They included miracle spring water, ordinary tap water presented as spiritually charged. Recipients were instructed to send money back to activate God's blessing. Some sent monthly payments for years. Consumer protection agencies later identified Popoff's ministry as one of the most persistent faith-based financial scams operating legally in modern America. While many televangelists skirted ethical boundaries, Popoff crossed and recrossed the line with surgical precision. Yet criminal accountability remained elusive, because his promises were framed as belief, not contractual obligation. Proved difficult. Faith-based fraud exists in a legal gray zone where lies are protected by religious freedom claims. Popoff understood this better than law enforcement ever did. He learned exactly how far he could go without being stopped, and he went there again and again. For victims, the aftermath was devastating. Financial harm compounded existing poverty. Emotional trauma fed depression and isolation. Shame silenced many, especially religious seniors, unwilling to admit they'd been manipulated. Popoff never apologized. He never returned money. He never acknowledged wrongdoing beyond declaring persecution by non-believers. To this day, his ministry continues, operations, still extracting money from followers, convinced God is about to fix everything if they just give a little more. What makes Peter Popoff's crimes especially corrosive is how openly transactional they were. God became a vending machine, faith became currency, and suffering became marketing. No physical violence was involved. No cult compounds, no isolated villages, just a man, a Bible, and a payment processing system. His story exposes a fundamental truth about modern corruption in faith. Harm does not require secrecy. It can thrive in daylight, protected by belief and shielded by law. Popoff was not a madman. He was not delusional. He was methodical. He understood human desperation and monetized it. And as long as belief is treated as legal immunity, men like Peter Popoff will continue to profit from hope, break trust, and disappear behind scripture when the damage is done. Because when faith becomes a business, desperation becomes inventory, and God's name becomes a sales pitch. Corruption doesn't need darkness to survive. It just needs believers taught never to ask where the money went. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Few figures exposed the depth of corruption inside modern religious power structures more clearly than Marcial. Maciel, once celebrated as a spiritual genius, a champion of Catholic orthodoxy, and the founder of one of the Church's most influential movements in Europe and the world. For decades, he preached discipline, purity, obedience, and devotion to Rome. Behind that image, he lived a double life built on sexual abuse, financial fraud, and institutional deception so extensive that even after it was exposed, many refused to accept it. Was born in Mexico but rose to global influence, with deep institutional power across Italy, Spain, Ireland, France, and the Vatican itself. His religious order, the Legionaries of Christ, became a favorite of conservative Catholic elites in Europe. Wealthy families sent their sons to legionary schools. Devout parents believed their children were being trained to become morally superior priests in defense of the faith. Maciel cultivated that image meticulously. He demanded absolute obedience. He taught that questioning superiors was a sin. Discipline was harsh. Spiritual authority was absolute. His followers were taught that suffering in silence was holy and that loyalty to the founder was loyalty to Christ himself. That doctrine would become the mechanism through which abuse thrived. Behind closed doors, Maciel was a serial sexual predator. He abused seminarians, boys, and young men, often framing his actions as spiritual tests, acts of obedience, or medical necessities. Some victims were told that what was happening was God's will. Others were warned that speaking out would destroy the church. The abuse spanned decades. Even more disturbing was how early church leadership knew. As early as the 1950s, complaints reached Vatican officials. Detailed reports described sexual assault, coercion, and abuse of power. Rather than investigate transparently, church authorities buried the accusations. Maciel was quietly shielded from scrutiny, protected not because evidence was lacking, but because his order brought prestige, money, and influence. The legionaries flourished across Europe. Elite schools opened in Spain. Seminaries expanded in Rome. Recruitment surged in Ireland and France. Maciel raised millions of dollars, much of it from European donors, who believed they were funding the future of Catholicism. Those funds were not merely for religious work. Maciel secretly siphoned resources to support multiple double lives, including mistresses and children. Facts that would not surface publicly until after his fall. Inside the order, fear was pervasive. Members who questioned leadership were disciplined or expelled. Whistleblowers were labeled rebellious or psychologically unstable. Victims were told their memories were sinful temptations. In some cases, they were required to apologize for accusing Maciel. Rome remained silent. For years, Maciel was publicly praised by Vatican leadership. He was invited to major church events. He appeared beside popes. His image was polished as a defender of moral purity, while those he abused watched their abuser be elevated again and again. It wasn't until the late 1990s and early 2000s that the walls finally began to crack. Survivors, now adults, came forward publicly. Some were European priests who had spent years wrestling with shame. Others were former seminarians whose lives had been permanently altered. They told consistent stories, detailed stories. They named dates, locations, and methods. The evidence was overwhelming, and still, institutional resistance remained strong. Only after immense pressure and a change in Vatican leadership did the Church finally act. In 2006, Marcial Maciel was ordered into a life of prayer and penance, a punishment that conspicuously avoided criminal prosecution or public trial. The decision outraged survivors and reform advocates across Europe. He was never imprisoned. He was never publicly interrogated by church authorities. He died in 2008, having avoided earthly accountability. But even death did not contain the fallout. Investigations after Maciel's death revealed the full scope of deception. He had fathered multiple children with different women in different countries. He had used church funds to support secret families. He had lied consistently to Vatican officials while claiming divine inspiration. Worst of all, evidence confirmed that high-ranking church officials knew and continued to protect him. The Legionaries of Christ were forced into reform. Leadership admitted Maciel had lived a double life devoid of scruples. Victims were finally acknowledged. Apologies were issued. But for many, it rang hollow. European Catholic communities were shaken. Parents questioned. Former members spoke of emotional damage that lasted decades. Faith collapsed for thousands who believed institutional Catholicism would never protect a monster for the sake of power. Marcial Maciel's case stands as one of the clearest examples of corruption at the highest levels of modern faith. Not merely the crime of one man, but the conscious decisions of an institution to preserve influence over justice. This was not ignorance. This was not confusion. This was management. Maciel had money. He had recruits. He had political capital inside the Vatican, and so, victims were sacrificed to preserve the image of holiness. His story forces a brutal realization. Corruption in faith does not only exist on the margins, in obscure cults or fringe churches. It can live in marble halls, operate across continents, and hide behind tradition older than nations. Maciel preached obedience. He demanded silence. He weaponized holiness as immunity, and because the system chose power over truth, he was allowed to destroy generations of lives in the name of God. That is the price of faith without accountability, and Europe is still reckoning with it. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Joachim S., a man once lauded as a moral pillar in his small Bavarian town of Regensburg, Germany, seemed to embody everything a faithful servant of the church should be. For decades, he led Evangelist Gemeinde St. Michael, a modest but highly respected evangelical congregation, preaching about integrity, honesty, and the responsibilities of spiritual life. His sermons drew people from surrounding villages. His advice was sought by local politicians, business owners, and families. To many, he was the human embodiment of righteousness. But behind the impeccable exterior, Joachim's wove a web of deceit, exploitation, and fraud so complex and brazen that it shook the German religious community to its core. Joachim's rise began in the early 1980s. A young theology student, he was charismatic, articulate, and seemingly deeply pious. Professors at University Regensburg described him as intelligent, studious, and destined for a significant ecclesiastical career. His sermons during his student years were noted for their emotional depth, blending Lutheran doctrine with practical advice on community and morality. By the time he was ordained, Joachim had already cultivated a reputation for personal charm, persuasive authority, and an uncanny ability to gain the trust of both church members and the wider civic community. When Joachim took over St. Michael's Parish in 1989, the congregation flourished, attendance increased dramatically, and donations surged. Church-led charities, youth programs, and community outreach projects expanded. Joachim's influence extended beyond the congregation. He was invited to advise local councils, speak at schools, and even mediate in neighborhood disputes. Many locals claimed he had a near-magical ability to soothe conflict and inspire loyalty. But the first cracks in Joachim's facade began appearing in the mid-1990s. Parishioners noticed unusual financial activity. Fundraising money for charitable causes often disappeared, and church accounts seemed opaque, even to the board. When members inquired, Joachim assured them that all funds were properly managed, citing administrative necessities, mission trips, and community outreach. His calm, persuasive demeanor made doubt seem almost sacrilegious. Questioning Joachim was framed as questioning God's will. By the early 2000s, Joachim had begun operating an elaborate financial scheme. He invested in local real estate ventures, claiming profits would fund church programs. In reality, he diverted millions of euros into personal accounts, purchased luxury cars, financed private trips, and even acquired a private villa outside Munich. To conceal his actions, he forged accounting documents, manipulated donor reports, and employed trusted church staff to act as intermediaries. These individuals, loyal and often unwitting, helped maintain the illusion of legitimacy. While financial deceit was the first layer, Joachim's moral corruption extended far beyond money. Several female parishioners later reported inappropriate behavior, late-night counseling sessions, suggestive comments during private meetings, and emotional manipulation framed as spiritual guidance. One young woman testified that Joachim told her that resisting his attention was resisting God's plan, effectively weaponizing faith to gain control over her. These abuses were systematic, and his influence made victims fearful to speak out. His power was absolute. Doubt was dangerous, defiance socially isolating. The scheme began to unravel in 2008, when a former church accountant, Klaus M., noticed discrepancies while preparing a tax report. Klaus, initially loyal to Joachim, discovered evidence of fraudulent transfers, falsified invoices, and unaccounted cash flow. When he raised concerns internally, Joachim responded with intimidation, suggesting legal repercussions and threatening the accountant's reputation. Klaus decided to contact external authorities, fearing that continued internal reporting would put him at risk. The Bayerische Landeskriminalamt Bavarian State Criminal Police initiated an investigation. For months, Officers discreetly monitored St. Michael's finances, conducted interviews with staff, and cross-referenced bank records. The deeper they probed, the more extensive the fraud appeared. Joachim had siphoned nearly 4.5 million euros over a decade, hiding assets under multiple accounts, shell companies, and falsified contracts. While financial investigators were unraveling the web, other victims stepped forward. Former parishioners disclosed emotional manipulation and coercion. Several women testified that Joachim's sermons, private advice, and personal attention had been used to manipulate them into compliance. Some had been threatened with spiritual condemnation if they revealed his misconduct, a tactic that caused long-lasting psychological trauma. Psychologists later described Joachim's behavior as narcissistic exploitation, amplified by religious authority, noting how he systematically targeted vulnerable individuals. By 2010, the case exploded into public awareness. German media covered the scandal extensively, describing Joachim as a pastor who had abused both trust and faith. Headlines read, "Shepherd of Shadows betrays flock, and millions lost, souls shaken." The Joachim scandal. Parishioners were shocked, many expressing disbelief. Some refused to accept the allegations, citing his decades-long public service. Others were devastated, acknowledging that their trust had been manipulated for personal gain. The legal proceedings were complex. Prosecutors faced the challenge of disentangling 10 years of financial manipulation while accounting for victims' testimonies of emotional and spiritual abuse. Forensic accountants detailed each fraudulent transaction, tracing money across banks, real estate, and shell accounts. Witnesses testified about Joachim's psychological manipulation, providing a comprehensive picture of how he used his role as pastor to exploit the congregations. In 2012, Joachim S. was convicted on multiple counts: fraud, embezzlement, and sexual coercion of minors and young adults. He received a combined sentence of 15 years in prison and was ordered to repay the stolen funds, though much of the money had been spent or hidden. The sentence reflected not only the severity of his crimes, but also the breach of trust inherent in his position as a spiritual leader. The aftermath in Regensburg was profound. St. Michael's congregation was devastated. Attendance dropped by more than 70%, and many parishioners left the church permanently. Local religious organizations expressed alarm over the case, using it as a cautionary tale about unchecked authority. Former staff members reported long-term trauma from participating in the cover-up, whether knowingly or unknowingly. Psychologists noted widespread spiritual disillusionment among the community, with many struggling to reconcile their faith with the betrayal of someone they had trusted implicitly. Victims' advocacy groups in Germany highlighted the case as an example of systemic vulnerability within religious institutions. They pushed for stricter oversight, transparency in church finances, and formal mechanisms for reporting misconduct without fear of retaliation. The German Evangelical Church Council issued a public apology, acknowledging the failure to provide proper oversight and emphasizing that Joachim's actions did not reflect broader religious teachings. Joachim remains incarcerated. Reports indicate that he has shown little remorse, often attributing his actions to external pressures rather than personal moral failure. Psychologists studying his behavior classify him as a master manipulator, capable of maintaining dual identities, publicly revered, privately exploitative. His case remains a cautionary example of how charisma, authority, and institutional trust can be weaponized. The town of Regensburg, though shaken, has slowly begun to rebuild. St. Michael's continues under new leadership, emphasizing transparency, accountability, and mental health support for Yet the shadow of Joachim's crimes lingers, serving as a lasting reminder that even those who claim to serve God can commit unspeakable acts when faith is manipulated for personal gain. For many in the congregation, the hardest lesson is one that extends beyond money or reputation. The realization that spiritual betrayal can be as damaging as any physical or financial crime. Trust once given can be weaponized. Faith once cherished can be corrupted. And the consequences last far longer than the sentences imposed by courts. Because when a shepherd becomes a predator, the flock doesn't just lose money, it loses innocence, security, and the certainty that those meant to protect them will do no harm. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Paul Schäfer, though originally from Germany, left a dark footprint that would span continents. blending religious authority, psychological control, and outright criminal exploitation. To many, he was a man of God, a pastor preaching salvation, morality, and obedience. To others, he became the architect of one of the most infamous religious cults of the 20th century, a secretive German enclave in Chile where fear, manipulation, and abuse became daily life under the guise of faith. Schäfer's early years offered little foreshadowing of his later infamy, at least to those outside his inner circles. Born in 1908 in Bonn, Germany, he was raised in a deeply religious household that emphasized obedience and moral discipline. As a young man, Schäfer joined various evangelical organizations and seminaries, often displaying extraordinary organizational skill, charisma, and a strict personal code. But behind this facade, colleagues noted a controlling streak, a tendency to dominate peers, and an unsettling obsession with authority that would later manifest catastrophically. In the 1950s, Schäfer fled Germany amid allegations of sexual misconduct toward children in the communities he served. These early accusations never resulted in convictions due to limited documentation and the willingness of local authorities to overlook religious leaders' transgressions. Undeterred, Schäfer sought a fresh start and founded across the Atlantic. By 1961, Schäfer had established a colony in the remote foothills of the Andes in Chile. He called it Colonia Dignidad, ostensibly a philanthropic community where Germans could live according to strict moral and religious principles. To outsiders, the colony appeared charitable and spiritual, offering medical care, education, and a model of disciplined living. Schäfer preached morality, self-sufficiency, and absolute obedience to God and the community. For decades, the facade was convincing. The colony was seen as a beacon of German culture and faith transplanted to South America. Inside, however, Schäfer's rule was nothing short of totalitarian. Residents were cut off from the outside world, subjected to relentless surveillance, and indoctrinated into Schäfer's rigid hierarchy. Children and adolescents were especially vulnerable. Reports later revealed that Schäfer maintained systematic sexual abuse of minors under his care, framing these acts as necessary spiritual lessons. Those who resisted were punished with psychological torture, deprivation, or physical violence. Religious language and doctrine became tools of oppression, compelling absolute submission. The abuse extended beyond the spiritual and psychological. Schäfer required residents to work long hours, often under dangerous conditions, in agricultural fields, workshops, or construction projects that funded the colony's growing wealth. Any form of dissent was labeled as rebellion against God. Punishments ranged from solitary confinement to beatings. Staff members who attempted to report or resist were ostracized, threatened, or forcibly removed. By the 1970s, Schäfer had established a deep and insidious relationship with the Chilean government, particularly the military dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. He provided Colonia Dignidad as a secret detention and torture center for political prisoners during Pinochet's regime. Detainees were held, interrogated, and tortured within the colony, often with Schäfer's direct knowledge. This collaboration gave him unprecedented protection. Local authorities ignored complaints, and even international observers were initially unable to penetrate the colony's secrecy. Faith, fear, and state complicity created a fortress around Schäfer's crimes. For decades, Schäfer's public persona remained untarnished in German circles. He continued to represent himself as a philanthropist, pastor, and model citizen. Charitable donations flowed in from European supporters. Visitors were given carefully curated tours that masked abuse, labor, exploitation, and systemic torture. Even reports of children being mistreated were dismissed or rationalized through Schäfer's eloquent justifications. His control over both narrative and environment was almost absolute. The first cracks in Schäfer's empire appeared in the 1990s, as former residents escaped and began speaking out. Survivors described ritualistic abuse, sexual exploitation, psychological control, and a suffocating culture of obedience enforced through fear. Testimonies painted a picture of a man who manipulated faith as a weapon, using scripture to justify horrors and instill guilt in those who resisted. His sexual abuse of minors, which had remained hidden for decades, became the central focus of legal investigations. Investigations revealed staggering financial exploitation as well. Schäfer had amassed significant wealth through donations, forced labor, and secret investments. Residents were often required to surrender earnings or property to the colony. Money meant for charitable causes or personal advancement was diverted to sustain the leader's lavish lifestyle and to maintain the colony's infrastructure. In 2005, after years of investigation and international pressure, Chilean authorities finally acted. Schäfer was arrested and charged with multiple crimes: sexual abuse, child exploitation, forced labor, and complicity in human rights violations. The trial was lengthy and emotionally charged. Survivors came forward to testify about decades of abuse, labor exploitation, and the suffocating climate of fear. Psychological experts described Schäfer's behavior as the ultimate fusion of narcissism, sadism, and religious authority, capable of controlling individuals' minds and manipulating entire communities under the guise of salvation. In 2006, Schäfer was convicted on numerous charges and sentenced to 20 years in prison. He died in custody in 2010, but his legacy of corruption, manipulation, and predation left scars on hundreds of lives. Many survivors continued to struggle with trauma. Having spent formative years in isolation and under constant psychological pressure, Colonia Dignidad has since been dismantled, but remnants of Schäfer's influence persist. Former residents formed advocacy groups and survivor networks to provide counseling, legal assistance, and support for those impacted. The case sparked international dialogue about the dangers of unchecked religious authority, the vulnerabilities of isolated communities, and the importance of oversight for leaders wielding both spiritual and administrative power. Schäfer's story serves as one of the most chilling examples of how a pastor or any religious leader can manipulate faith, authority, and institutional trust to perpetrate crimes on a massive scale. His German roots, combined with a foreign sanctuary, allowed decades of unchallenged exploitation. For historians, psychologists, and religious scholars, the tale of Pastor Paul Schäfer is a cautionary saga. Faith, when weaponized by a corrupt leader, can become the foundation of a prison rather than a sanctuary. Communities may flourish superficially, but when spiritual guidance is corrupted, the most vulnerable suffer irreparable damage. Even decades later, survivors continue to ask themselves, and the world, how could a man who preached salvation become the architect of suffering? How many others hide behind the facade of holiness, wielding power with impunity? The legacy of Schäfer's crimes remains a dark reminder that unchecked authority, charisma, and religious devotion can combine to create some of the most harrowing abuses in modern history. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Christophe Rocancourt, though widely known in France as a master conman, spent a period of his life exploiting not just wealth but faith itself. Born in 1967 in Villejuif, France, Rocancourt's early life was marked by instability, poverty, and a fascination with stories of luxury, power, and manipulation. From a young age, he learned how to charm, persuade, and deceive, skills that would later define his notorious career as a fraudster and manipulator. While his criminal exploits spanned the globe, one particularly chilling chapter involved him assuming the identity of a religious figure, using the trappings of pastoral authority to defraud the faithful in Paris and across Europe. In the early 1990s, Rocancourt arrived in Paris claiming to be a deeply spiritual man, a pastor dedicated to restoring morality in the community. He rented a small chapel and began delivering sermons that blended social morality, faith, and practical advice for overcoming poverty and personal challenges. He dressed impeccably, spoke with a combination of intellectual polish and emotional appeal, and quickly built a modest following of parishioners who were drawn to his charisma and apparent piety. The congregation was small at first, largely composed of individuals struggling financially or emotionally. Rocancourt's approach was simple yet effective. He offered guidance, community, and hope. He encouraged members to invest in community projects and faith-based ventures, promising both spiritual growth and material benefit. It was a perfect storm for a man of Rocancourt's talents, a trusting group of followers, limited oversight, and a leader who exuded confidence and authority. Over time, Rocancourt's ambitions grew. He began soliciting larger donations, claiming they would fund the construction of an orphanage, expansion of the chapel, and educational programs for disadvantaged youth. Parishioners, inspired by his sermons and reassured by his charm, contributed generously. Some donated life savings, others invested property or personal assets, all under the belief that they were advancing God's work. Behind the scenes, Rocancourt was orchestrating a massive fraud. He diverted funds into personal accounts, purchased luxury goods, and traveled under false pretenses, all while maintaining the appearance of a devout pastor. He reinforced his deception through subtle psychological tactics. He claimed divine inspiration for financial strategies, positioned himself as uniquely gifted by God to guide the church, and shamed dissenters by implying that skepticism was a lack of faith. By the late 1990s, Rocancourt's operation had expanded internationally. He claimed connections with wealthy philanthropists and religious leaders, convincing European aristocrats and American donors to contribute to his projects. Using forged documents, fake endorsements, and elaborate stories of charitable success, he created a global network of trust that he then exploited for personal gain. Despite his growing empire, cracks began to appear. A few skeptical parishioners started questioning the lack of transparency in finances. Some attempted to verify his claimed connections and charitable works, only to discover that many were fabricated. Others noticed inconsistencies in his personal stories, including claims about previous ecclesiastical titles and missions abroad that could not be corroborated. As pressure mounted, Rocancourt intensified his manipulation. He framed skeptics as spiritually weak, preached that true faith required obedience and generosity, and isolated critical voices within the congregation. His ability to blend emotional appeal with pseudo-religious authority kept most parishioners loyal, even as rumors began to circulate. Eventually, French authorities began investigating complaints related to his financial dealings. In 2001, law enforcement officers uncovered evidence of large-scale fraud, including misappropriated donations, falsified accounting records, and bank transfers to foreign accounts. While Rocancourt initially evaded capture, media coverage and mounting legal scrutiny forced him into hiding. Further investigation revealed the extent of his deception. Rocancourt had spent years using the guise of pastoral authority to exploit faith, manipulate vulnerable individuals, and amass personal wealth. His victims included not only parishioners in Paris, but also international donors who had believed in his charitable projects. Many reported severe emotional trauma, compounded by the spiritual betrayal of someone they had trusted as a moral and religious guide. Rocancourt's crimes went beyond financial exploitation. Several parishioners described being coerced into acts that reinforced his control, recruiting new members, performing unpaid labor, and participating in rituals framed as spiritual exercises. Those who resisted were publicly shamed or quietly ostracized. Psychologists studying the case later described his tactics as classic cult behavior, manipulation through authority, fear, and a blend of charisma and pseudo-religious ideology. In 2002, Rocancourt was finally arrested in Mexico, beginning a protracted legal battle that would span continents. He faced multiple charges, including fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. Victims came forward to testify about the betrayal of trust they had experienced under the guise of religious mentorship. Courts in France, the United States, and Mexico coordinated extradition and prosecution efforts to hold him accountable for crimes committed across national borders. During trial, prosecutors emphasized the dual nature of Rocancourt's deception. He exploited both faith and financial trust. Witnesses described the emotional devastation of believing in a pastor who used scripture and spiritual authority as tools of manipulation. They recounted how his sermons had lured them into a false sense of security, only to be followed by betrayal. In 2003, Rocancourt was convicted in multiple jurisdictions. While sentences varied, he ultimately served time for fraud, theft, and other related offenses. However, the spiritual and emotional damage inflicted upon his victims remained long after the legal consequences ended. Many victims reported enduring PTSD, financial ruin, and a lasting skepticism of religious authority. The case of Pastor Christophe Rocancourt stands as a stark reminder that corruption within religious institutions is not limited to overt acts of violence or sexual misconduct. It highlights the ways in which charisma, intelligence, and the perception of divine authority can be weaponized to exploit trust. His ability to manipulate both faith and finances demonstrates the vulnerability of communities that place absolute trust in leaders without oversight. Even years later, survivors of Rocancourt's fraud speak about the psychological impact of having their spiritual beliefs weaponized against them. They describe a lingering sense of betrayal that extends beyond money and material loss. a fundamental fracture of faith, trust, and moral certainty. Authorities and religious scholars alike cite the Rocancourt case when discussing the importance of transparency, accountability, and vigilance in religious communities. Churches, seminaries, and philanthropic organizations now study it as a cautionary tale. Charisma without checks, authority without accountability, and faith without scrutiny can create the perfect environment for deception and abuse. The story of Pastor Christophe Rocancourt remains haunting because it demonstrates a universal truth. Even the most devout appearances can conceal a corrupt heart. Trust, once given in the sacred space of worship, can be weaponized by those who understand both human psychology and the power of faith. And for those who knew him, the lingering question remains: how many other pastors, cloaked in righteousness, are exploiting belief for personal gain while hiding in plain sight? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Luc Jouret, a Belgian-born physician turned spiritual leader, became infamous as the mastermind behind the Order of the Solar Temple, a secretive cult responsible for one of the most shocking mass deaths in modern European history. Born in 1947 in Belgium, Jouret initially pursued a conventional path, studying medicine and establishing himself as a well-respected physician. But beneath the surface of academic achievement lay a man obsessed with spiritual transformation, mystical teachings, and the promise of transcendence. Over time, this obsession led him to exploit faith, manipulate followers, and orchestrate one of Europe's most chilling tragedies. Jouret's transition from physician to pastor and cult leader began in the 1970s. He traveled extensively, studying esoteric teachings, occult philosophies, and various new religious movements. He was drawn to ideas of purification, ascension, and preparing select individuals for a higher plane of existence. His eloquence, charisma, and intellectual aura made him an effective recruiter, convincing individuals from France, Switzerland, and Belgium to follow him on his spiritual journey. By the early 1980s, Jouret co-founded the Order of the Solar Temple, blending Christian mysticism, esoteric teachings, and apocalyptic prophecy. He presented himself as a spiritual guide with a divine mission to lead his followers toward enlightenment and salvation beyond the material world. He preached about the imminent collapse of worldly institutions and promised that the select would transcend physical life to join a celestial realm. At first glance, the OTS appeared to be a disciplined spiritual community. Members were encouraged to meditate, study sacred texts, and engage in charitable works. The rituals were elaborate, and Jouret's charisma fostered unwavering loyalty. Followers described feeling spiritually renewed, intellectually stimulated, and emotionally secure under his guidance. Many believed that Jouret was a conduit to higher truths, someone uniquely equipped to interpret divine will. However, beneath the veneer of spirituality lay manipulation, coercion, and control. Jouret cultivated dependency among his followers, controlling finances, personal relationships, and access to information. Members were required to pay large sums to join, contribute assets, and participate in costly rituals. Those who questioned his teachings or intentions faced ostracism, emotional punishment, or threats of spiritual condemnation. His authority was absolute, reinforced by the belief that he possessed special knowledge about life, death, and salvation. By the 1990s, Jouret's influence extended beyond his immediate followers. The OTS had chapters in Switzerland, France, and Canada, and media coverage began highlighting its growing prominence. With this visibility came scrutiny. Authorities, journalists, and skeptical families began investigating the order, raising questions about financial transparency, recruitment tactics, and the mental well-being of members. Jouret's response to scrutiny was both cunning and ruthless. He doubled down on the apocalyptic narrative, claiming that external pressures were evidence of the world's corruption and validation of his teachings. Members were told that only absolute obedience and preparation would secure their passage to the celestial realm. Families of members were cast as agents of negativity, threatening the spiritual progress of the initiates. This psychological manipulation reinforced isolation, dependence, and compliance. The situation escalated in 1994, culminating in a series of horrific events that would shock Europe. In Switzerland and France, authorities discovered that dozens of OTS members had died in ritualistic mass suicides and murders, many in remote chalets set ablaze. Autopsies, forensic analysis, and survivor testimony later revealed that some deaths were coerced, with individuals pressured to participate in lethal rituals while others were murdered to maintain secrecy or enforce loyalty. Jouret himself was found dead in one of the burned chalets, reportedly by suicide. Though his direct involvement in coercing deaths remains a subject of investigation, the psychological and social mechanisms that enabled these deaths were complex. Jouret used a combination of charisma, fear, and religious authority to normalize extreme behavior. Followers internalized the idea that death was a transition, that questioning leadership was tantamount to spiritual failure, and that obedience was both sacred and necessary. Experts later described this as apocalyptic, a form of influence in which religious and esoteric ideology justifies and facilitates lethal behavior. Media coverage following the events was extensive and shocking. European newspapers detailed the ritualistic nature of the deaths, the international scope of the cult, and the manipulation that led otherwise rational individuals to participate in mass murder and suicide. Survivors reported long-term trauma, not only from the loss of friends and family, but also from the profound betrayal of trust. Many had been recruited with promises of spiritual enlightenment, only to experience psychological manipulation and coercion that led to death. The Order of the Solar Temple remains a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked religious authority and charismatic manipulation. Jouret's actions demonstrated how individuals with knowledge, charm, and strategic control over faith can exploit vulnerability, isolate followers, and orchestrate tragedy. Scholars studying the case emphasize the intersection of charisma, esoteric doctrine, and apocalyptic narrative as a potent mix that enables profound psychological control. For those left behind, the story is one of enduring grief and existential confusion. Families struggled to understand how loved ones could be persuaded to commit acts of self-destruction. Survivors described a lingering sense of guilt, questioning whether they could have intervened, recognized manipulation, or resisted indoctrination. Psychologists note that the trauma from such coercive religious environments can last decades, affecting relationships, trust, and personal identity. The legacy of Pastor Luc Jouret and the Solar Temple is deeply unsettling. It serves as a reminder that religious authority can be weaponized, and that even intellectually capable adults can fall victim to manipulation when belief, fear, and charisma are combined. The deaths of dozens, the psychological scars of survivors, and the societal shock all underscore the catastrophic consequences of blind faith in a corrupt leader. Even decades later, scholars, journalists, and psychologists continue to study Jouret's methods, attempting to understand how charisma and religious authority can intersect with coercion to produce mass tragedy. His story is a chilling reminder. The most revered leaders may hide motives far darker than the public ever perceives, and the cost of misplaced trust can be catastrophic. In the end, the followers of Luc Jouret lost more than lives. They lost innocence, certainty, and the ability to trust spiritual guidance. The Order of the Solar Temple remains a stark example of the human cost when religious authority becomes corrupt, and when belief is manipulated into obedience to a deadly agenda. The haunting question persists: how many modern leaders, cloaked in righteousness and charisma, could similarly manipulate trust under the guise of faith? The stories you've witnessed today expose the hidden corruption behind some of the most trusted figures in faith. Pastors, leaders, and guidesmen who claimed divine purpose betrayed trust, manipulated belief, and preyed on the vulnerable. These are not just crimes of money or power, they are crimes against innocence, morality, and humanity itself. If these revelations shocked you, it's time to take action. Subscribe to uncover more deep investigations into the world of corruption, deception, and the dark truths hidden behind closed doors. Like this video to ensure these stories are not forgotten, and share to spread awareness and give voice to those who were silenced. Because when trust ends, vigilance begins. The world must never forget the lessons left behind by the most corrupt pastors in modern history.